Okay, welcome back. Shoot. Welcome back, and let's go to the slideshow from the beginning. Welcome back to Unit 2. We are now going to be, for this lecture, talking about ceramics, but before we do, just had a few points I wanted to cover at the very end of that last lecture on the axial age. I was just talking about the development of Greek culture and the development of Greek ceramics, and how in the history of Greek ceramics we can see both the fact that the Greeks had their own particular take, the way they used ceramics to tell narrative, especially something kind of particular that we see as a connection between the geometric period and the black figure period and the red figure period. But we also see a lot of influence on Greek ceramics. So there's this period in the middle called the Orientalizing period, and that basically means that was a period when Greek ceramics was highly influenced by the ceramics that they were seeing from the Persian Empire, especially from the parts of Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, that were controlled by the Persians. So, all right, now back to our regularly scheduled lecture, which is on ceramics. So, why are we talking about ceramics? Ceramics is the main art medium, art material that we're going to be talking about for Unit 2. And one of the reasons why we're talking about it is precisely because it played such an important role in ancient civilizations, in ancient history, and especially right there at that last transition, the transition from the Persian Empire, period where the Persian Empire controlled the Mediterranean world to the classical period. It was Greek ceramics in a way that kind of was this signifier of that transition, that change. And ceramics is a very old medium, right? Keep in mind that we started with drawing, which I guess if you think about some of the wall paintings or the petroglyphs in caves that some of the earliest ones, potentially 70,000 BCE, so that's very early. But ceramics is also pretty early, and we have fired figurines from about 20,000 BCE or so, and that's pretty old as well. And then fired vessels, vessels that are things that are made to hold stuff, we have, I think, about as early as like somewhere between 15 and 11,000 BCE and from China. So it's pretty old material. So we're going to be talking about why ceramics is important first before we discuss anything else. So it's very old, as I said, but probably the most important reason why it's such an important tool for archaeologists who study the Neolithic period and the ancient civilizations going all the way up to like 500, 300 BCE is because ceramics is a fantastic means for documenting dating and documenting transitions of cultures. Because one of the things about ceramics is that most ceramics are pretty easy to break. You take this pot and you drop it on the ground, and it will shatter into a lot of pieces. But then those pieces will get picked up and thrown into some rubbish pile somewhere, and they will stay in that rubbish pile forever. Like those pieces are called shards, by the way, and shards are they will potentially can last for far longer than any other kind of debris that cultures create. So when we find, let's say, a new Neolithic town, and we find some stone walls, whatever, and then we find some pottery, the pottery is a great way to help us date that for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is because sometimes the pottery stored stuff, and there might be the remains of organic material on the insides of that pottery, and that can give us carbon dating, but also because the styles of pottery tend to change in very consistent manners, and that allows archaeologists to be very accurate. Sometimes, like in the periods, let's say in what is now Israel, the period in the Levant, the periods of 900 BCE to 500 BCE, ceramics, the changing styles of the different kind of ways that people paint and shape the ceramics can give dates as precise as 30 or sometimes even 10 years apart, whereas carbon dating is much more like within 50 years or 100 years. So ceramics is important. And also ceramics is it's just a part of human culture all over the world. And it's different all over the world, and yet in some ways fundamentally the same. And I think that also makes it truly important. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize that some of the most beautiful objects in the world, some of the most beautiful things that when you go to an art museum that you might see are going to be pots, are going to be ceramic pots, handmade ceramic pots. They're easy to overlook. You go to a museum, it's easy to be impressed with sculptures and paintings, but pause and take a look at the ceramics sometimes and you will be amazed. So next we're going to talk about some of the different ways that ceramics can be constructed. So there are two main divisions. Ceramics can either be constructed by hand building or by wheel throwing. So here we have a lot of examples of hand building, such as a pinch pot, a little diagram of how to make a pinch pot, or coil building. Right? That's an image of Maria Martinez working on a coil building pot. Notice she's got a wooden bowl for the base as a starting point. And here is an actual ceramic pot that she made. And look at how smooth and how perfect it is. It would be, you know, if you first saw this piece, you would assume that it was made on a wheel. But it is a coil-built ceramic vessel. Also, sometimes hand building was a great way to build ceramic figurines. But wheel throwing is also pretty important. I guess I'll talk about wheel throwing a little bit later. So another major component we're going to talk about is the different types of clay. Some of my best friends are ceramicists, and they've explained to me quite patiently that there's really an infinite variety of types of clay, and that every potter has their own kind of formula of what they're looking for the clay. But it is also true that through the history of the world, we have broken up ceramics into three major categories in terms of the types of clay. There's earthenware ceramics, or terracotta, there's stoneware, and then there's porcelain. And the earthenware is fired at the lowest temperature, the stoneware is fired at a higher temperature, and the porcelain is fired at the highest. Stoneware is the strongest, it's the hardest, and usually kind of heavy. Porcelain is the lightest, and usually it will fire almost to a glass-like finish. And porcelain also is very fragile and easy to shatter, but very, very tough. And terracotta is the most porous. It needs to be glazed in order for it to be not porous. And terracotta is also the most fragile. So there you go. So if you went to a ceramic studio, and keep in mind, so far what we've learned is we've learned the basics about hand building and the difference between hand building versus wheel throwing. And we learned the three main types of ceramic or clay bodies, as a ceramicist would call them. So if you went to a ceramic studio, you'd see a couple of different things. And so here are some terms to understand. You would see pots that were made and had not been fired and been left to sit on a counter and to dry. They'd usually be, if the potter was still working on them, they'd be covered in a bag so that they wouldn't dry up too fast. Okay, I have about a minute left, so I'll just finish on this page. So pots that have not yet been fired are called greenware. Pots that are still being worked on are often referred to as leather hard. That is kind of a desired state for greenware where it can still be worked. And once it's bone dry, another term that ceramicists like to use, then it's ready to be bisque fired, which means it'll be put into a kiln, which is a type of oven, and fired for the first stage. The goal of the bisque firing is to completely dry out, take all water content out of the clay, and also to make it hard. Hard so that you can pick it up and move it around, but it's still not as hard as after it's been glaze fired usually. Anything that's been fired in a bisque fire is called bisqueware after that point. It's